Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 2021 Vermont Forest Health Webinar Series. Perhaps you were here last year in 2020 with our first go round of the webinar series instead of the meeting that we normally hold in Woodstock. But we're doing the webinar again this year. It was successful last year, and it just makes sense at this point in time. So thank you for joining us. If you did attend last year, things are pretty similar. We're going to be having two talks today. One I'll be giving on the Vermont Forest Health Update. And my name is Josh Hallman, if you're not familiar with my voice. I'm a forest health specialist and the acting forest health lead for Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation. So I'll be giving an overview first this morning of kind of the health conditions throughout the state in 2020 and some of what we know so far in 2021. And following that, Nicole Kelleher is going to be joining us. She's the Forest Health Program Director down in Massachusetts, and she's going to be talking about the recent Gypsy Moth outbreak down there. And you'll probably see the relevance there as I conclude my talk this morning. Wanted to go over just a couple logistics this morning. I'm keeping cameras off today just because the PowerPoints are large and just to make sure it's a little smoother sailing for us. But in addition to that, wanted to let folks know about credits. I'm sure most people are interested in that. And so we have this particular webinar is approved for 1 SAF credit or Vermont Licensed Forester credit as well. As well, there is 1 pesticide credit available for today's webinar. And in order to get that credit, you need to answer 3 questions at the very end of the webinar to show that you attended. And the way to access that is actually when we're completely done with the webinar, if you close out of the program, a pop-up will appear on your screen automatically directing you to answer those questions. And so you complete those, submit, and that'll be logged into the system and we can submit those. If you do have to go immediately at the end of the webinar, there will be a follow-up email so that you do have the ability to answer those questions and receive the credit a little bit later. So either answer them right after the webinar or wait for that email to come through. Let's see. In terms of questions for today, you'll notice in your GoToWebinar side panel there's a tab for questions. If you can put your questions in there, we'll kind of consolidate those, and at the very end of the webinar, so not after my talk, but after Nicole's, we'll kind of run down those, summarize them, and get those answered for you as best we can. I think that's the bulk of it. I should note as well, this is the first of 4 webinars for this series. They'll all be occurring on Tuesday mornings for the next 3 weeks after today. They will all begin at 8:30 in the morning. Look for announcements on those coming through the Forest Health mailing list, or if you are a state employee, a different email will be sent out to you, but all the same information basically. And what we have coming up is next week will be a talk on the impacts of climate change to forests of Vermont. Ali Kasiba is going to be sharing that with everybody. The week after that will be a webinar on beech leaf disease and spotted lanternfly. And finally, the last webinar that we have as part of the series will be looking at forest health and the role of bird monitoring and the role of forest health on bird abundance and health as well. So a pretty varied schedule this year, and hopefully you can attend at least a couple of them. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into my talk here, and we'll get going here. So again, thanks for attending, and please put your questions in the chat. So as I mentioned, I'll be going over kind of the highlights from 2020. Obviously, 2020 was a very different year for all states with COVID-19 around and our ability to get field work done. And so I'll address that as we go forward here, but we'll just kind of walk you through some of our standard monitoring efforts and where we stand and what our results were from last year. So let's see here. One of the first things that we look at in the calendar year is what's going on with Hemlock woolly Adelgid in our state. So currently it's in the southeast corner of the state, and it's been there for some time in Windham, Windsor, and Bennington counties. In 2020, we did not detect any new towns or counties having Hemlock woolly Adelgid present. We do surveys every year to look for the insect, And although we have 3 counties with it confirmed, we've expanded those monitoring efforts originally just to Rutland and Orange counties. But this year, actually over the winter of 2020 and 2021, we were able to expand that even further and include Addison, Chittenden, and Franklin counties in those monitoring efforts. And with those additional counties included, we still have not detected spread of the insect up into those counties. So that's good news for us. One thing that we are keeping an eye on as well is elongate hemlock scale, which is an insect that is commonly present along with hemlock woolly adelgid. They sometimes co-occur. And so the largest populations we see of those are in the southeast corner of the state where HWA is. But we are getting reports, and we've seen a couple locations in northwestern Vermont and Chittenden County where elongate hemlock scale has appeared in the absence of hemlock woolly adelgid. And so here's a couple pictures of what we found up there. What's interesting here is you'll notice some different species. The scale obviously is this kind of this white look on the underside of the foliage. And these are insects that, you know, they can deplete the resources of the trees pretty quickly. But they focus on hemlock, but as you can see on the right side of this picture, we have some ornamental firs that have been infested by the insect as well. And in fact, the first detection we had of this up in northwestern Vermont was actually on some planted balsam fir. And we were able to actually eradicate that from that particular site using a dinotefuran product to treat the trees that were there, and it effectively killed them from that plantation. So that was great news. This is in Shelburne, Vermont, and this is kind of a larger area that has elongate hemlock scale. And luckily, the community there has coordinated efforts, and they plan on treating these trees and trying to get rid of the insect there. But we'll still keep tabs on that to see if that expands or if the treatments are actually effective there. Along with that, when we're out looking for the presence of hemlock woolly adelgid, we are also looking at the winter mortality of them. So by collecting branches, bringing them back to the lab, and identifying what proportion are actually living after the winter season, we can kind of predict how successful those populations are going to be in persisting or causing any new damage. And we have 2 years of data here now, actually. So 2020, you can see on the far right side of that graph, only had about 39% mortality of the adelgids that we brought into the lab, which is pretty low, especially when you look back in time compared to some of those higher percentages of winter mortality where 99% were killed basically in 2014 and 2015. In 2021, there was greater winter mortality. These results just are fresh in from the lab. But it's still not up to a threshold where you would expect significant dieback in the population there. Nevertheless, we're still not seeing big spread of hemlock woolly adelgid in Vermont right now. And perhaps one thing that could be at play is there's some new research showing that high summer temperatures actually can knock the populations down a fair bit. I think it's if you cross the 86-degree Fahrenheit threshold, you start to see some mortality of hemlock woolly adelgid. So there may be another factor in play there as well. But despite the relatively low mortality of HWA in southeastern Vermont, luckily we're not seeing a big spread. Another springtime activity we do is we monitor sugar maple phenology. So when bud break occurs, and typically with that, we monitor for pear thrips populations, which can cause some damage to maple leaves as they're emerging from their buds. In 2020, we had a pretty limited survey window because of COVID. We weren't able to get out into the field when we wanted to. And as a result, we couldn't put pear thrips traps out. But we were able to monitor bud break of sugar maple at a site in Underhill, but get kind of a late jump on things. And so these are those data here. You can see, despite the title of the slide, what you're looking at here is the phenological progression of sugar maple in 2020. And you can see that we were unable to get out into the field until late April that year. But despite that, things were kind of slowed down anyway, and we didn't have a very rapid bud break. You can see the dotted line is the 2020 data. The solid line is the long-term average. So our bud break was significantly later than the average bud break. We had, I think bud break occurred on May 11th in 2020, and then rapidly resulted in full leaves. but it was a slower progression, which differs greatly from this year. So we're still in the middle of monitoring bud break for those same sugar maple and underhill this year. And already we've seen bud break there. Bud break occurred on April 12th this year at the Underhill site. And we've been collecting these data for about 30 years now. And that is the earliest bud break we've seen on record for these sugar maple in that 30-year period. So that's certainly something interesting. We'll see how full leaf out progresses. And at this point, luckily, even though we've had a couple nights below freezing, I've not seen any frost damage of maples or other trees on the landscape, luckily. You know, it was pretty cold last night, so we're not out of the woods yet in terms of cold temperatures. So we'll see if any damage is incurred because of the early bud break. But this is certainly very early for what we're used to with sugar maple. Probably the pest on most people's radar in the state right now is emerald ash borer. And as most of you are aware, I'm sure, it's in Vermont. We detected it first in 2018. You can see some of the signs of it in the tree on the left here. And this map that you're seeing on the right is from 2020, and just showing all the different counties that have confirmed emerald ash borer in the country. So I mentioned that's 2020. What's interesting in Vermont is that if you look at how our infestation map has progressed from 2020 to 2021, you see quite a number of new detections. So I'll take a quick moment here to explain this map if you're unfamiliar with it. Each one of these circles, so that the dark orange is centered on a known detection, whether that's by identifying an infested tree, whether it's by having an insect land on a purple trap, and it's a 5-mile radius out from that detection that we determine as the confirmed infested area. And then an additional 5 miles out from that is that yellow kind of concentric circle there that shows a high risk of infestation. So these are areas where people should be on the lookout for emerald ash borer and be aware of how to manage and deal with their woodlands should they become infested. What you can see here is that we have had quite a bit of spread. Some of it is natural, as you can see in the major cluster there that's kind of centered around Plainfield, Vermont. But then there's some other satellite detections that came up. And one thing I should mention about this map as well is we're currently in the process of getting a little more information on this to show kind of the severity of the outbreak in each one of these locations. So I would expect that that'll be available for folks to see in the coming months, just to let you know exactly how severe the EAB outbreak is in your particular area. But we use a number of tools to help detect emerald ash borer in the state. And one of the most useful ones that we have is by fielding landowner requests or requests from within A&R of folks that see suspicious trees. And we go out there to identify whether or not EAB is confirmed. And so this map's showing all those locations from late 2019 to present where people have been out in the field and collected these data. We've seen a few detections result from this. So it's definitely a great tool. Probably the easiest way for folks to submit a suspicious tree is through the website vtinvasives.org. And there's a report it function there where you can submit all the relevant information so that we know what to look for and where to go and that sort of thing. So I encourage you, if you do see suspicious trees, to go to that website, and we'll have staff take a look at the information that you send. Another tool that we have are establishing trap trees. So this is basically girdling trees in the spring, ash trees, which ultimately can send up a stress signal to emerald ash borer and attract it to those trees. And so in 2020, we girdled 38 trees in the spring. This is largely on public land, and we let them stay there for the duration of the growing season. And at the end of the growing season, we cut the trees down and peeled back the bark and looked for EAB larvae. And this did result in 2 detections this last year, one in Bennington County and one in the Groton area. So, so it is an effective tool, and we intend on doing more of these this year as well. One thing folks may have heard about is this program called EAB Biocontrol. which essentially, if you're unfamiliar with biocontrol projects, they're basically releasing parasitoids, so things that would parasitize emerald ash borer, into the forest so that they can detect emerald ash borer, lay their eggs in the larvae or eggs of emerald ash borer, and as the parasitoid eggs emerge and develop, that ultimately kills that life stage of EAB. And so it's definitely a good tool to have in the toolbox. It doesn't necessarily eradicate a population, but it can reduce the population of EAB in a given area. And if these parasitoids are able to establish their own population within Vermont, they can continue to feed or continue to use the EAB larvae and eggs as host material without us needing to reintroduce them every single year. So that's kind of the goal of the program. If you're really interested in it, I'm going to be talking a little more in depth on it on May 20th as part of the webinar series for Emerald Ash Borer Awareness Week. So you can find some information about that. But let's see, in 2020, we had 2 sites where we released insects, one in Plainfield, one in South Hero. And at each of these sites, we had about 4,500 insects released. And it was just one species of parasitoid that we had, though it's a stingless wasp, smaller than the size of your pinky fingernail. So you basically never see them on the landscape, but they are effective. And this next year, we will be releasing actually 3 species of parasitoids, 2 that target the larvae of EAB, 1 that targets the eggs, and those will be in those same 2 locations. I should mention that this is a biological program. We're not injecting insecticide into these trees where we're doing our biocontrols in Vermont. It's just the releases. And yes, we'll have 3 species at these 2 locations, and we will continue to look for new sites. We want to have more releases in more counties where EAB is present in the state, and focusing on public land. So that'll be a big effort of ours this growing season. Another thing that we look at is white pine needle damage. This is not the salt spray that's damaging pines on the roadsides. This is more something a little more interior to the forest, where we're seeing yellowing of needles and early needle drop as a result of fungal complex of 4 species that can infect the needles of white pine. And you can see on this graph here, the higher the number, the more severe it is. And so in 2019 and 2020, pretty heavy yellowing within our plots. We have 4 locations in the state, and defoliation was pretty significant as well. One thing to note about this is that the severity of white pine needle damage is based on the previous year's moisture in the spring, and 2020 was pretty dry. So hopefully that's a good sign for what we'll see this year with white pine needle damage, that it could be reduced because of that dry spring in 2020. We'll know that pretty much by the end of June is when we go out and do these ratings. Another pine species that's having issues in the area is red pine. And you can see from the picture on the top of your screen there that this can happen pretty rapidly and can take out full stands. It's something that we're investigating and that we're interested in, because we have seen a progression of red pine mortality in the state that's been increasing over the last 5 to 7 years. I should point out that this is the first map that you're seeing, which is typically our aerial survey data from where we fly over the state and document what's happening on the landscape, where the forest damages are. And this is from 2019, of course. You're seeing about 556 acres of damage. In 2020, we were not able to fly the state as part of our normal aerial survey because of COVID-19. And so I'll be presenting a few slides of what we were able to document, even without being in the plane last year. Our hope is that this year that'll be different, and that we can actually get up in the plane and start mapping again like usual. But to get back to red pine, this again is the progression of red pine mortality in the state. You can see it's expanded from 2014 to 2019 as you go left to right here, with a number of sites popping up. And so last year we started establishing a monitoring program to look at sites where red pine's present, to kind of rate their crowns, assess the health of the trees in general, as well as do some sampling to identify what fungal species might be present, what insect species might be present, that could be causing this decline. Red pine scale has been shown in a couple nearby states to be a culprit in this. However, we're not seeing that as the main driver of this mortality event in Vermont. So we're keeping an eye on this, doing some sampling. Some things we've isolated from the samples we've taken are Diplodia and pine gall weevil. But we'll continue monitoring these sites for about 5 years and see if we can track which stands are in the worst shape and see if we can pair that up with a causal agent. So more to come in the years with that. Forest tent caterpillar in 2020 was pretty much a non-story. We had the outbreak from 2016 to 2018, and now we're not detecting any defoliation from forest tent caterpillar, which is great news. We have noticed some mortality and dieback in patches of those areas that were heavily hit by forest tent caterpillar. We couldn't really get eyes on that very well this last year, but hopefully by being in the plain, we'll be able to see if those areas have expanded or not by this year. One maple pest we did see quite a bit of this year, though, was maple leafcutter. This is a late season defoliator. You can see the picture there of what it looks like on the landscape. It kind of creates like an early fall color within forests. And depending where you are in the state, some have experienced this for a couple years now. But it is a late season defoliator, and so we don't expect this to have a very significant effect on tree health because it happens so late in the year. But with multiple years of it occurring, it's something that we definitely want to keep an eye on. And this actually, because of the timing of it, this is one thing we were able to devote some time to getting up and observing in person in 2020. And the way that we achieved this was actually by putting the boots on and getting up on mountain summits or getting into fire towers and using our mapping equipment to map polygons of where we saw damage. And despite that kind of limited footprint that we had by using that method, we were still able to map over 18,000 acres of damage from maple leafcutter in 2020. So hopefully we'll get a more comprehensive picture of that, because this is obviously an underestimation of exactly how much was on the landscape in 2020, but we'll continue to monitor that this year. And here's the tie-in for the next talk, is that one other monitoring program we have in the state that we've had for over 30 years now is monitoring gypsy moth populations. So in the spring, we have 9 sites throughout the state where we wrap trees in burlap, which is something that gypsy moths kind of gravitate towards in order to lay eggs, excuse me. And so we put burlap around those trees in the spring, and in the fall, we go back to those same locations and count the egg masses that we find underneath the burlap and on the trees there. These are relatively small plots. But in 2020, we had higher numbers than we've seen in years, almost 30 years maybe, since we've seen the level of egg masses that were present. And I should note that these are largely in the Champlain Valley, where we saw these high numbers of egg masses. So there is the probability and the likelihood that we will see some defoliation this year from gypsy moth on the western side of Vermont. Because we don't know how extensive that's going to be, or the impacts, and because this will be the first year and most trees can defend themselves after 1 year of defoliation, Vermont will not be excuse me, coordinating any spray efforts this year for gypsy moth populations, but we're definitely going to be assessing this and looking at the effect on the landscape. And to show you the numbers that we're talking about here, you can see the 2020 gypsy moth egg mass counts are roughly similar to what we saw in 1990, the last time that we were on the end of an outbreak. So I'd expect that you'll hear more about this in the coming months, and we'll definitely be keeping folks up to speed with the progression and what we're seeing. Just a couple other quick notes here of other things in 2020 that we heard about or were looking for. Saddled prominent is a hardwood defoliator that we had a few calls about of leaf fragments dropping to forest trails, that sort of thing. And there certainly was plenty of activity of saddled prominent, but it didn't really cause any landscape scale defoliation. So it wasn't anything that we detected very heavily or that we expect to really cause big tree health problems. Oak wilt is something that we continue to look for. It is not in Vermont right now. We had one tree that looked like it was suspicious down in Rutland, but sent samples down to UMass, and it was determined not to be oak wilt. So that's very good news as well. Spotted lanternfly, as I mentioned, that we'll have a talk on that in a couple weeks. There was one dead spotted lanternfly that was detected on poinsettia material of all things, but no live specimens were found in Vermont. But this is definitely something that we're keeping on our radar as well. And new for this year, wanted to let folks know that you may have heard of something called beech leaf disease, which is impacting American beech, of course. It first was noted, I believe, in the Ohio area, and is kind of moving its way through the Great Lakes region a little bit. We're going to be establishing 8 monitoring plots within the state, and as I mentioned, there will be a talk on that in 2 weeks as well. And finally, we'll be doing some trapping for southern pine beetle, which the name sounds like it shouldn't be here, but folks have been seeing that in Long Island and other locations further north. And so just to take a look and see if there's anything to be concerned about in Vermont, we will be putting out some of those traps in the coming weeks. So that's the quick overview of what's gone on in Vermont in the last year. And would like to thank our contributors, our funders, and although this says questions, I'm going to pass it over to Nicole right now so that she can begin her talk. So thank you. And again, if you want to put questions in the questions box, we will make sure that those are answered at the end of the presentations here. Okay, Nicole, you should have power.
All right, thanks, Josh. Let me just get full screen. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Kelleher, and I am the Forest Health Director with the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. I'm going to talk a little bit about our recent Gypsy Moth outbreak event and the oak mortality event that we kind of saw after that Gypsy Moth impact. And Gypsy Moth, really, it's nothing new for us here in Massachusetts. We've had it for over 150 years. And I want to apologize as being the source of Gypsy Moth. We actually had the first population in Medford, Massachusetts in 1869. And pretty much for the first 100 years we had it here, we kind of went through these cyclical outbreaks where we'd have populations build up, cause a devastating amount of defoliation, then kind of fall back down a few years later, building back up again, until we hit the late 70s, early 80s, where we had the most extreme outbreak we'd ever seen, culminating in over 2 million acres of defoliation in 1981. So it was really, that was our most hard hit time by Gypsy Moth. Then by 1989, Entomophaga omega, which is a very host-specific pathogenic fungi, became established in our landscape here, and it quickly spread throughout the state, impacting our Gypsy Moth widespread throughout the area. So after that highly effective fungus came through, we didn't really have those quite as common cyclical outbreak events. When we did see Gypsy Moth, it'd be much more localized, smaller areas, less of a duration. So we hadn't really had a big outbreak until 2015, where we saw once again the devastating impact of this insect. And for those of you not familiar with Gypsy Moth, it feeds in its caterpillar life stage when it causes most of its damage. So throughout the winter, you'll see the little egg masses on trees. They're a little bit fuzzy, kind of like a tan buff color, about an inch and a half long. And you'll see them on trees and cracks and crevices, on rocks, on headstones and cemeteries, on the side of your house. They'll lay them wherever they are. And then in early spring, so for us down here in Massachusetts, late April, early May, depending on the year, they'll hatch out. The caterpillars will start moving up into the trees and start feeding. They'll feed through June, when then they'll pupate, and then the pupa take 2 weeks to form, and then we'll see the adult moths flying late July, early August. So that caterpillar life stage is where they're doing all their feeding and where all of the damage kind of comes from. So in our most recent outbreak event, when I say widespread, it's kind of continuous areas where we saw impact from them, and the impact was very severe. So trees that were completely defoliated, which means losing over 75% of their leaves. And in some stands, you'd stand and it looked just like winter. You wouldn't see a leaf in sight. The picture above is near our Quabbin Reservoir, which is in the center of our state and is the water source for Boston. And that was one of our highest hit areas where you'd stand and you wouldn't see any leaves. Every oak, not just every oak, but every hardwood would be completely defoliated. And so this kind of started in 2015. So in 2014, we kind of had a little bit drier conditions that limited the effectiveness of Entomophaga omega. So since it is a fungus, it has specific life conditions it needs to be able to survive. So it's soil borne, it rests in the soil over the winter and then comes out. So if you don't have nice, cool, wet springs where those spores can get not only activated out of the soil, but then onto the caterpillars and then be moist enough for them to be able to sprout and get in and infect the caterpillars, you won't see that mortality that it causes. So 2014 was dry and 2015 was the first year we kind of started seeing gypsy moth coming back out of the background. So it's always present in our state. We always have low levels here and there, but in 2015 the population started to really build up and we saw noticeable defoliation throughout the eastern 2/3 of our state. By 2016, those areas really expanded out where we saw much larger pockets of severe defoliation and extremely heavy, dense populations. And by 2017, it really blew up into this huge, widespread areas throughout central Massachusetts, but also in our northeast area and then down through the Cape and on the islands as well. Luckily, in 2017, we saw a dramatic reduction in the population. We saw a lot of caterpillars dying from entomophaga and also the virus NPV, and those areas kind of shrunk back down as we had less caterpillars causing less defoliation, so it was a little bit pocketed. And by 2019, we saw very little defoliation. Much like you guys up in Vermont, we weren't able to fly and do our aerial survey in 2020. It's kind of hard to social distance in a tiny little plane with 3 people, but we did use aerial satellite imagery and we didn't detect any defoliation from that last year, and we didn't get any on the ground reports of serious defoliation in 2020. So when we had this widespread event, we were seeing most of the feeding is concentrated on oaks. So oaks are the highly preferred species for gypsy moth. They'll feed on over 200 different species, but oaks are their go-to. So in central Massachusetts, our northern red oaks are a real dominant oak species in the forest. As you move east, we see it kind of shift ecotypes, and our black oaks are the more dominant oak types. And then in those really coastal areas, we have shrub oak ecotypes that were then impacted. But when you do have these dense populations, they'll start on oaks, they'll move on to any other hardwoods. They also will go after things like apples, cherries, they'll get onto maples. They don't like things like hickories or ash quite as much, but then when they're larger and they're hungry and all the oaks are gone, they will move on to that. Luckily, our hardwoods are really resilient. So a hardwood tree can lose every leaf, and then by mid-July, we'll kind of see them starting to push out a new flush of leaves. So they have enough energy stored in their roots that if it's a healthy tree, it can push out new leaves. So by the end of the summer, it looks like, it doesn't look like nothing happened. The leaves that come out aren't quite as robust and strong looking. They can be a little weird, but they do still have a full canopy of leaves usually. When you get into the second and third years of defoliation, a tree is really stressed. It's missing that peak photosynthesis time in June and early July, so it's not getting those energy stores down to its roots, so it doesn't have those resources if it gets hit again by defoliation. When we had extreme feeding, we also saw the caterpillars dropping down on some of our understory pines and hemlocks. Unfortunately, pines and hemlocks aren't able to push out new leaves mid-season, so when these get defoliated, they do die. So we didn't see it in our nice big mature white pines, but some of the smaller seedlings and saplings that are under the oaks in the forest did get defoliated, and we did see small amounts of mortality here and there. Not quite as much mortality in the hemlocks, but you'd see occasional feeding and find a caterpillar lurking around sometimes. So when we look at the kind of the total acreage that we saw, it really grew tenfold in that 2015 to 2016 time. And it's not that the gypsy moth suddenly moved to all these places. We always kind of had some gypsy moth, but the populations were able to really dramatically increase throughout the whole area over that time. And it really peaked in 2017, hitting just over 900,000 acres. And you'll kind of see, we started seeing acreage of oak mortality after that, and it kind of trails the gypsy moth defoliation a little bit. So we'll see defoliation, then a year or two later, we're kind of seeing that peak mortality from that. And it's because the gypsy moth aren't what actually kills a lot of the trees. So most of the trees will actually re-leaf out. They'll go into the fall or come out of winter actually looking like they're going to be okay. If you weren't really looking closely, you might think, oh, this tree's healthy, it's fine, it made it through the gypsy moth event. But there's actually a lot of secondary invaders and other stressors that kind of take place after that initial event of the gypsy moth defoliation that do cause the trees to die. So gypsy moth, they're not the final murderer in this, but they are the ones that kind of started off this process that caused us to lose quite a lot of oaks. So we probably saw a peak of around 70,000 acres of oak mortality. And when I say 70,000 acres, I don't mean every tree in 70,000 acres died. Most of the time, it's between 5 and 10% that we're able to detect. So not great, still losing a significant amount of trees, but you still do have up to 90% of your oaks in that area. We are losing maybe 10%. Sometimes there are smaller pockets, like up to 5 acres, where we do see a more significant tree loss, but most of the time we were seeing more widespread, lower level of the most stressed and weakened trees. So what kind of caused that population to build up and then fall back down? So the lack of Entomophagum omega, so dry spring conditions in 2014 and then 2015 allowed that population to really explode. Even if you only have a handful of successful mating male and female pairs of moths, your population can boom really quickly. Each egg mass has between like 50 and 200 eggs in it. So a huge number of caterpillars can really emerge from one tiny egg mass. So even if you only had 10 mating pairs in an acre, suddenly you have thousands more caterpillars in that acre. But when Entomophagum omega is effective, when we do have those ideal conditions and it does able to effectively get on the caterpillars, it can cause over 90% population mortality. So huge amounts of the caterpillars can be wiped out. Also, when the population gets big, the nucleopolyhedron virus, so NPV infections, can really hit the populations. And as we probably all learned in the last year, in order for viruses to kind of spread around, you actually have to interact and bump into each other. So it usually only has significant impacts in the population when you have a very dense, big population where the caterpillars are all over the same tree, all over each other, and able to spread that virus around. And when you do have these big populations, it does cause over 90% mortality as well. So luckily in 2017, we saw huge amounts of mortality, both from Entomophagum omega and NPV. The picture on the far right, those are all dead caterpillars. It was a tree that basically from ground up to like 10 feet was just coated in caterpillars that had died. So that was a pretty common sighting throughout the state. So a huge reduction in population, a huge reduction in defoliation the next year. At the end of 2018, we weren't seeing quite as much Entomophagum omega mortality again, and we were a little bit concerned, but coming into spring of 2019, It was a weird, cold, wet spring, so it was warm enough that they hatched out and that the caterpillars kind of started metabolizing, but it was too cold and too wet for them to actually get up into the canopy and start feeding. So we saw egg masses where we just had hundreds of tiny little caterpillars that just kind of starved to death right there. And then last year in 2020, we didn't, it was hard to actually assess what was going on in the population since there were so few again, and it's kind of trying to pick a needle out of a haystack, finding a location where there are active caterpillars. So we didn't see a lot. From reports that we did have, it seemed like they were dying back. I did get some reports from out in far western Mass, so out in the Berkshires, where we didn't see gypsy moth in this outbreak event, getting more sightings of the moths and finding more egg masses. So we'll be doing some more intensive surveys in the next couple weeks out there to kind of see if those actually do hatch out and if we do have significant feeding out there. So when we have these multiple years of impact, so as I said, a healthy tree can get completely defoliated and be fine. But when we look overlaid the 4 hardest hit years of this outbreak event, we have a lot of locations that did see 3 and even 4 years of significant defoliation. And it's mostly in these areas where we saw a lot of that oak mortality, and we're seeing the longest lasting impacts from this outbreak event. So these are out in lower central Massachusetts, down near the Connecticut border, and you can kind of see the widespread mortality that we saw in trees. These are from 2019. And so there's pockets where you'll see much denser tree loss, but then areas where it is a little bit more widespread and kind of scattered dead trees. So some of the areas where we saw the much denser pockets were those areas that did have 4 full years of defoliation. And some of the more widespread areas are areas that did see multiple years of defoliation, but were more impacted by those secondary stressors. And then these are some of our coastal oaks that kind of saw that same sort of impact. So it wasn't just our huge, big northern red oaks, but some of our smaller oaks that might not look as impressive, but are incredibly important to the ecosystems out in those areas. So what are we expecting for 2021? So we are pretty confident that we've ended this cycle of the outbreak, and we're kind of in back to those low background levels. So when Actimophaga omega became established in Massachusetts, it kind of shifted how gypsy moth functioned. So before it was a kind of a very heavy invasive and kind of what we think of as an invasive species, something that is constantly pressuring our trees, to kind of being naturalized and acting a little bit more like some of our native forest pests. So things like eastern tent caterpillar, forest tent caterpillar, prominent caterpillars, so other defoliators where, yes, we'll have times where we do have these population outbreaks. Usually it's a little bit more localized, smaller areas, not throughout the whole state, not that severe, shorter lasting. So we're now expecting it kind of to return to those background levels, to be more acting like that naturalized pest. So we do have low population densities in middle defoliation in 2020. We're expecting to see something very similar in 2021. We use a little bit different of a method than Vermont. We abandoned using those burlap straps just because they're kind of a pain, and we didn't think they were kind of capturing things statewide. So we used randomized grid point sampling. So in areas that are identified as possible risk locations, we overlay a grid and then randomly select up to 10% of those grids, 1 kilometer grids. So using that method, we get a pretty good sample across the state and look for egg masses. So we do have some pockets where you'll see the red dots that there is a potential for severe defoliation. So we're seeing the number of egg masses that could correlate to a population that can cause defoliation at those higher levels. It doesn't necessarily mean we'll see that because they still need to hatch out, get up there, start feeding, and not be impacted by things like MPV or get eaten by mice throughout the winter, or parasitized by other flies that can impact gypsy moth populations. So these areas that could potentially hit that, but we saw very few of those, and they're really kind of spread out, not all in one dense area. So we're pretty confident that coming into 2021, we're looking good gypsy moth wise. But we still do have other additional forest stressors. So as I said, some of the areas that we saw the trees die weren't areas that we saw 3 to 4 years of defoliation. And we did see kind of a lag in mortality in our oaks because these other secondary stressors. So the biggest one in this outbreak event was the 2016 drought. So over 90% of Massachusetts experienced some sort of a heavy, so category 2 or higher, drought conditions in 2016. And the drought actually persisted through the fall and winter and even up to the next spring before we were able to leave those drought conditions. So it was pretty impactful to trees throughout our state, not just our oaks, not just the areas hit by gypsy moth, but it's an additional stressor that really pushes our gypsy moth impacted trees kind of over the edge. So when there's a drought, trees just they're not taking up as much water, they're not photosynthesizing as much, they're just more stressed out than they normally would be. And then adding on top of that, losing all their leaves, it's really not a great combination for them. And we also had other pests that had been either before or around the same time, so slightly before that 2015 timeline, out in our coastal areas. On our black oaks, we saw black oak gall wasps. So these create tiny little galls on the twigs of a tree and kind of cause the tree to die from the outwards in. And it was really causing a bit of mortality on its own before gypsy moth then hit out there. We also had quite a bit of winter moth out in our coastal areas as well. So this is also another early season defoliator, so feeding on oaks as well. So some of our trees were already starting off with a defoliation event to then have defoliation events caused by gypsy moth. So kind of seeing those areas that in 2014 and then 2015 also had winter moth in some of the same areas where we then kind of had our gypsy moth building up. And then after these trees are stressed out, there's just a lot of naturally occurring native funguses and insects that are out there in the forest that they do play an important role of kind of going through declining and dead trees, impacting them. But when you have this outside invasive species factor coming in and causing an unnatural stress event on our trees, it allows these native pests and pathogens to kind of boom a little bit more than we would normally see in our forests. So we had native boring insects. So we have things like two-line chestnut borer was pretty much the most common. So you'll see it right under the bark in the cambium layer feeding. It's actually related to emerald ash borer and kind of looks pretty similar. And then we had some of our cerambycid borers like red oak borer and hickory borer. They bore a little bit deeper into the trees, but all of these are native insects that are abundant in our forests that kind of took advantage of the situation and got into these stressed out oaks. We also had a lot of funguses, so basically anywhere a fungus could get in, they would. The most common we were seeing is armillaria. So armillaria comes from the roots up, and it's also known as shoestring fungus. It'll cause these black shoestrings and then these white mycelial fans. So we were seeing a ton of trees that had very heavy armillaria coming up and impacting them. And then, so we kind of saw a loss of trees, but we also have some ongoing forest stressors that are continuing to stress out these oaks. So we saw the peak of our gypsy moth population. We saw the peak of this oak mortality event, but we are still losing stragglers here and there, some trees that just never fully recovered and never really got the chance to get through one nice, healthy growing season to kind of get their vigor back going again. And it's because we kind of just, there's always stressors out in the forests. We saw things like shot hole leaf miner, licanium scale, other defoliators like fall webworm, which is usually later in the season, not a big deal for a lot of trees and is limited to their webs, but we're seeing trees completely covered in webs the last year and the year before. So other natives just kind of out there getting into the trees. and some that were causing pretty severe damage. So this is fall cankerworm out on Nantucket. So it looks similar to winter moth. It's a very early season feeder, and it was causing pretty widespread damage in those shrub oak barrens in the center of Nantucket. So going forward, we hope that this outbreak event was kind of an outlier. We hope that we have gypsy moth kind of back to this naturalized state. Having these outbreaks is kind of one-off, so we hadn't really seen one quite this big in over 30 years. Hopefully we keep seeing that going forward. But as we have a change in climate, we don't really know how that's going to change how gypsy moth interacts with our landscapes, with our native trees, with these other funguses and other things that also rely on how the climate kind of functions. So going forward, we do expect to see an increased temperature. So we're going to have hotter summers, we're going to have longer growing seasons, we're going to have colder winters. So this might really impact how our fungus, the Entomophaga omega fungus, functions, how other smaller parasitoids and predators on gypsy moth impact kind of work, and how the gypsy moth themselves work. Are they going to hatch out earlier? Will their hatch line up with ideal times feeding on the trees? As you kind of get increases in temperatures, some species are very dependent on temperatures. Some are kind of more dependent on the light and the photostate as seasons change. So you can get this mismatch between species. So some that are coming out a little bit later while other ones are still early, or some that are coming out earlier while some are still later. So we don't really know how that'll look in the future. We're also expecting to get changes in our precipitation pattern here in the Northeast. So we don't actually expect to get less precipitation or that much more precipitation, but really how we receive precipitation is going to change. So having longer dry periods, getting our rain in more heavy events, which isn't great for funguses that we want to kind of persist and land and grow on these caterpillars. We're also expecting to see increased storm events. So when we have trees that are kind of stressed and weakened, that other insects are getting into, we can have a lot of breakage and damage from these storm events. And breakage and damage can also be vectors for other insects and diseases. So on oaks out in the Midwest, when they have big thunderstorms in early summer, those are the sites that they go out and find oak wilt most commonly later in the summer. It's because where it breaks, this trees will ooze and it attracts the beetles that will then bring the spores of the oak wilt fungus in. So storms can kind of vector other diseases as well. So even though we're having all of these changes, a lot of people are very negative and say things like, oh, we're going to lose our oak forests. I don't personally, I don't believe that. I think our oaks are going to persist. It just might be different, and we might see a different pattern going forward. This is a picture of the Quabbin Reservoir, which is in central Mass, which was heavily hit by gypsy moth. And this picture is from the early 1930s, before the reservoir was fully built. So a lot of logging, cleared landscapes, not a ton of oaks. By this time, we had already had gypsy moth in the area for over 2 decades. So it was causing outbreaks, being a significant problem in central Mass by this time. And this is the Quabbin today. So we have these healthy, robust, widespread oak forests that developed alongside of gypsy moth. So our forests are kind of young. Our forests of most of the state have actually grown with gypsy moth as a big component of it. So I personally believe, even though we still are always going to have gypsy moth, I do think we're always going to be able to keep having oaks that will be resilient to these outbreak events. So I'm going to turn it back over to Josh for some questions. But if we don't answer anything that wasn't in the chat, or if you think of things later, feel free to reach out to me. This is my email address, and if you go to the mass.gov website, we have more information and some of our data on gypsy moth there as well.
That's great. Thanks so much, Nicole. That was a really good talk, and kind of hits on a few things for us here in Vermont, right? We've, let's see, make sure folks are seeing the question slide here. There we go. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I was showing that we have an elevated number of gypsy moth egg masses in Vermont this year. So let's all hope for some rain and some moisture and get us out of this drought here. but the last part of your talk too was really great to hear about the impacts of a changing climate on forest health and some of those kind of indirect ways. You know, the extreme weather events, you know, causing branch breakage and making that a vector for other diseases. Certainly something that that's worth thinking about. And I'd imagine we'll have a few more examples of things like that in next week's webinar that's going over the impacts of a changing climate on the health of Vermont forests. Let's see, I answered a few questions in the chat from my talk. I don't know if folks have additional questions. We'll hang on here for a couple more minutes to see if you've got questions for Nicole. You can put them in that questions box again. And if so, then we can answer those for you in real time. A reminder that at the end of this, if you missed my announcement at the beginning of the webinar, if you're looking for pesticide credits, once you close out of the application here, you should have a pop-up that comes up to have you answer 3 kind of quiz questions, and then we'll pass that along to the Agency of Agriculture to get you those pesticide credits. Let's see. I think that's about it. I'm still not seeing any questions, so we'll give it another minute.
And if anyone has any non-Gypsy Moth forest health related questions for me too, I can answer those too.
Great, Nicole. We got a couple here. So the first one I have is, do you have any update on the Asian longhorn beetle situation in Massachusetts?
Yes, so the Asian longhorn beetle is actually one of the very few ones we can actually hope to eradicate, and we are really closing in on it. So in the early years, we were finding thousands of infested trees. We haven't found an infested tree in over a year right now. So they're still out there in very low numbers, and we're still cycling through the quarantine area, and quarantine is still in place. And we probably still have between 5 and 10 years left in our program, but we are making a dramatic impact on their population and are confident that we will be able to eradicate it.
Nice, that's great. I've got a couple other Gypsy Moth related questions, and actually they're all based on EM and NPV. So one person was asking whether we have evidence of both the fungus and the bacteria existing in Vermont. We do have evidence of that happening, and that's why I'm hoping for some rain here in the next couple months. So yes, those are present in Vermont. The other question below that, Nicole, is about how those were introduced and how those have spread throughout either the state or the region. I don't know if you have information on that or not.
So the virus is just kind of part of a population and kind of just moved with them. It's very host specific. And then the fungus, they're not exactly sure. So they had tried to release similar fungus strains very early, and then again in the early 80s, and didn't really have success. And then kind of out of nowhere in the late 80s, out in the wild, we saw it. So we don't know if it came in on other soils or infected stock in the horticultural trade or what, but it kind of got here on its own, and then it was able to really quickly spread. And since it's a fungus, it kind of spreads. It can spread on wind and in water and things like that. So it just naturally got out here and naturally rapidly spread across the landscape.
Great, thanks, Nicole. I think we got another 1 minute until the 9:30 hour, so we'll hang out and see if anybody else has any more questions. If you do have to leave, I just want to thank you for attending today. It's great to bring this back for a second year, and glad that we've got a diversity of speakers coming up this series. So looking forward to sharing more information in the forest health world with everybody here. All right, seeing no more questions, I think I'm going to call it. I want to thank Nicole again for joining us and giving a great talk on Gypsy Moth and forest health issues in Massachusetts. Again, as I mentioned, next week it'll be all about climate change and forest health. And look for announcements for those next 3 webinars. I'll be sending those out today. You'll be able to register for those just like you were for this webinar. And as I mentioned, we have pesticide credit available for this webinar. Next week will not be a pesticide credit available, but the following week, when we're talking about spotted lanternfly and beech leaf disease, we will have pesticide credits available. Oh, here's a question. So one last question, Nicole, if we still got you, is whether or not white pine needle damage is occurring in Massachusetts as well.
It is. We do see it pretty severe throughout Massachusetts. It's actually a problem from Georgia all the way up to Maine and out to Michigan. It seems to be everywhere there's white pine, they're seeing some level of this white pine needle damage. And the specific funguses we see in Massachusetts do overlap somewhat with some of the ones in Vermont, but we have a couple that we kind of see a little bit more than I think you guys see up there, but it is widespread.
Yep. Great. Okay, well, I think we'll call it here. Thanks everybody for attending, and thanks again, Nicole. And I also want to thank Kate Four from UVM Extension, who's helping put this on with us. This wouldn't be possible without her. So thank you, everybody, and hope to see you next week.
Thanks.
Thanks, Josh, for a great webinar, and thank you everybody for participating today. Just a quick reminder that when you close out of the webinar, the survey for continuing education credits will pop up. So if you're waiting for credits, please go ahead and close out of the webinar, and a pop-up window should come up requesting that you fill out the webinar survey, and that's where you'll request continuing education credits. Thanks again, everybody, and thanks Josh and Nicole for a great webinar. All right, folks, just one last reminder, if we're done the webinar, so if you want to go ahead and leave, the webinar survey will pop up through GoToWebinar, and that's where you'll be able to request your continuing education credits. I'm going to go ahead and shut down the webinar here in a minute. Thank you again for your participation today, and hope you enjoyed the webinar.